In the middle of the American Civil War, while a nation was tearing itself apart over race and slavery, the most powerful woman in the Confederate States was hiding a rumor that could have destroyed everything. She was the wife of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, but whispers followed her everywhere. Some said her dark eyes and olive skin meant something unthinkable in the slaveholding South, that the Confederate First Lady herself might have been of mixed race. In a society obsessed with bloodlines, that rumor alone could have shattered reputations, ended political careers, and ignited scandal across the entire South. So who was she really? Was Verina Davis simply a misunderstood Southern aristocrat, or the center of one of the most uncomfortable secrets in Confederate history? Because the truth about her life is far stranger and far more tragic than most history books ever reveal. In the spring of 1826, long before cannons thundered across the battlefields of the American Civil War, a child was born into a world already divided by race, power, and fragile pride. Her name was Verina Howell. Decades later, she would become Verina Davis, the wife of Jefferson Davis, and the First Lady of the Confederate States of America. Her husband would lead a rebellion that split the United States in two. His name would be written into history books as the president of a breakaway nation built on the defense of slavery. But long before the war, before politics, before Richmond, Washington, and the collapse of the Confederacy, Verina's story began quietly in the Deep South. And almost from the moment she entered the world, people were already whispering. Verina Howell was born on the 7th of May, 1826, into a prominent Southern family. Her parents, William Burr Howell and Margaret Louisa Kemp, were part of the planter class that dominated the social and economic life of the American South. Their home base was Natchez, Mississippi, one of the wealthiest towns in the region during the early 19th century. Natchez was not just prosperous, it was extravagant. Cotton money flowed through its streets. Massive plantations surrounded the town, and wealthy families built grand homes overlooking the Mississippi River. It was a place where fortunes were measured in land, cotton, and the number of enslaved people a family owned. In this rigid and hierarchical society, status meant everything. The Howell family belonged comfortably within that elite circle. Verina's father, William Howell, was a merchant and landowner who had once enjoyed considerable financial success. He was also a man of ambition and public spirit. Members of the family proudly traced their lineage back to influential figures in early American history. Verina's paternal grandfather had even served as governor of New Jersey in the 1790s, a detail that added prestige to the family's name. On her mother's side, the Kemp family was equally established. Her maternal grandfather was a wealthy Mississippi planter of Scots-Irish descent, a man who had built his fortune through land and enslaved labor like many Southern elites of the era. To outside observers, Verina had been born into privilege. But privilege did not shield a person from scrutiny, especially in a society obsessed with race. Verina was the second of 11 children born to William and Margaret Howell. In the harsh reality of the 19th century, however, many children did not survive infancy or childhood. Illness, poor medical knowledge, and epidemics were common threats. Only 7 of the Howell children would eventually reach adulthood. Even among her siblings, Verina stood out, not because of her personality at first, but because of her appearance. As she grew, people began to notice certain features that seemed unusual to many Southerners of the time. She had dark hair, deep brown eyes, and an olive-toned complexion that contrasted with the pale skin many associated with families of British ancestry. There was also the shape of her nose, broader than what some people expected from a woman of her background. Individually, none of these traits were extraordinary. Many families with Welsh or Mediterranean ancestry displayed similar features. But the American South of the early 1800s was a place where people constantly categorized one another. Race defined social order. Race defined power. Race defined who was free and who was enslaved. In that environment, even the smallest difference in appearance could spark speculation, and speculation spread quickly. Some people simply assumed Verina's looks came from her Welsh ancestry, which often produced darker complexions. Others, however, began quietly suggesting something more controversial. They wondered whether somewhere in the Howell family line there might have been Native American or African ancestry. No evidence supported such claims. But in the gossip-driven world of Southern high society, evidence was rarely necessary. A raised eyebrow, a whispered comment, a lingering stare at a young girl's face. That was enough. Those rumors would never fully disappear. In fact, they would follow Verina throughout her entire life, growing louder when she entered politics, and louder still when her husband became one of the most powerful men in the South. Ironically, the young girl at the center of these whispers had no idea how significant her life would become. In her early childhood, Verina simply lived as the daughter of a wealthy Southern family, surrounded by plantations, servants, and the rhythms of life along the Mississippi River. Her days were filled with lessons, family gatherings, and the expectations placed upon young girls of her class. Southern society had very clear ideas about what such girls were meant to become: elegant, obedient, charming, and above all, loyal to the traditions of their region. No one yet imagined that this quiet child, born into a world of cotton fields and social hierarchies, would one day stand beside the president of a rebellious nation, or that she would spend much of her life navigating suspicion, criticism, grief, and controversy. Because the whispers surrounding Verina Howell were only the beginning, and the life waiting ahead of her would be far more complicated than anyone in Natchez could have predicted. Although rumors quietly surrounded her appearance, Verina Howell's early childhood unfolded within the privileged world of the Southern elite. Her family moved within the social circles of wealthy planters and merchants who dominated life along the Mississippi River. In towns like Natchez, society revolved around land, cotton, and reputation. Families guarded their status carefully, and lineage was spoken of almost like currency. For a time, the Howell household lived comfortably. Her father, William Burr Howell, managed business ventures connected to trade and plantation agriculture. Like many ambitious men in the expanding American South, he believed the region's cotton economy would continue to bring prosperity. The Mississippi River served as a commercial highway, carrying cotton to the ports of New Orleans and wealth back to the plantation districts. Within this environment, Verina grew up surrounded by the rhythms of plantation life. Large homes stood on raised ground overlooking fertile fields. Carriages rolled along dusty roads connecting neighboring estates. Social visits, dinners, and formal gatherings were common among families of similar rank. Yet behind the polished image of Southern aristocracy lay a rigid and unequal system. Plantations depended entirely on the labor of enslaved African Americans, whose forced work produced the cotton that sustained the region's wealth. In the society Verina was born into, this system was not only accepted, it was treated as normal and necessary. Children raised in planter families rarely questioned it, but Verina's childhood would soon be shaped by events that disrupted the comfortable stability her family once enjoyed. By the early 1830s, her father's financial situation began to weaken. Like many Southern businessmen, William Howell had invested heavily in land and trade. But a combination of risky decisions and changing economic conditions began to erode his fortune. One investment after another failed to deliver the profits he expected. At the same time, the family maintained an expensive lifestyle typical of the Southern upper class. Entertaining guests, maintaining property, and supporting a large household all required significant money. As debts grew, it became increasingly difficult to sustain the appearance of prosperity that society demanded. The situation worsened year after year. Finally, by 1839, the pressure became impossible to hide. William Howell was forced to declare bankruptcy. For a family that had once stood proudly among Natchez's elite, the collapse was humiliating. Financial ruin carried social consequences in the tightly connected world of Southern society. Reputation mattered almost as much as wealth. Without help, the Howell family might have fallen completely from their former status, but assistance came from an unexpected source. Verina's maternal relatives, the powerful Kemp family, stepped in to rescue them. Margaret Howell's family possessed both the resources and the influence to stabilize the situation. Their support allowed the Howell children, including young Verina, to continue receiving opportunities that would have otherwise disappeared. One of those opportunities would soon change the direction of Verina's life entirely, because rather than remaining in the traditional environment of the Deep South, she would soon be sent hundreds of miles away to a city in the North where ideas about society, politics, and even slavery were very different. And there, far from the plantations of Mississippi, Verina Howell would encounter a new world that would quietly shape the woman she would eventually become. For many young women in the American South during the 1830s and 1840s, life followed a predictable path. They were educated just enough to manage a household, trained in social etiquette, and eventually married into families similar to their own. But Verina Howell's life would take a different turn. After the financial collapse of her father's business, it was Verina's wealthy relatives on her mother's side who stepped in to help secure her future. Rather than allowing her education to stop at the level typical for Southern girls, they arranged something far more unusual. Verina was sent north to Philadelphia to attend a boarding school for young women. At the time, Philadelphia was one of the largest and most intellectually active cities in the United States. Unlike the plantation towns of the Deep South, it was a place shaped by commerce, industry, publishing, and political debate. Newspapers circulated widely, ideas moved quickly, and social reform movements were gaining attention. For a girl raised in the world of cotton plantations, it was an entirely different environment. At the boarding school, Verina received a far more rigorous education than most Southern women of her generation. She studied literature, history, languages, and political thought. Books filled her days, and discussions about society and government were encouraged among students. Teachers quickly noticed that she was an intelligent and thoughtful student. She read widely and absorbed ideas that extended far beyond the social expectations placed upon women in the South. By the time she completed her studies, Verina had developed a reputation as one of the most well-read women among her peers. But the greatest influence of her years in Philadelphia may not have been the textbooks. It was the atmosphere of the North itself. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, the United States was already deeply divided over the issue of slavery. While it remained central to the economy of the Southern states, many Northern states had begun moving away from it. Abolitionist movements were growing louder. Newspapers debated the morality of slavery, and political arguments over the institution were becoming more intense every year. Living in Philadelphia exposed Verina to these discussions. She heard viewpoints that few young women in Mississippi would have encountered. The city's intellectual circles included people who openly criticized slavery and questioned the moral foundations of Southern society. Verina did not immediately become an outspoken opponent of slavery, but the experience broadened her perspective. Years later, when reflecting on her own identity, she once described herself in a curious way. Because of her connections to both the North and the South, she referred to herself as a half-breed. She did not mean this in a racial sense. Instead, she meant that her upbringing had placed her between two worlds. One world was the aristocratic plantation culture of Mississippi. The other was the more urban, politically diverse society of the Northern states. This unique position would shape many of her later views and create tensions in her marriage when she eventually wed a man whose beliefs about slavery were far more rigid. But at this stage in her life, Verina Howell was still simply a young woman returning home from school. When she left Philadelphia and traveled back to Mississippi, she carried with her an excellent education, a wider understanding of the world, and a mind far more independent than many people expected. What she could not yet know was that within a few years, a single meeting at a Christmas gathering would change the course of her life forever. Because in 1843, at the age of 17, Verina Howell would meet a man who was already well known in Southern political circles. His name was Jefferson Davis, and their meeting would eventually pull her into the center of one of the most dramatic chapters in American history. By the winter of 1843, Verina Howell had returned to Mississippi after completing her education in the North. She was no longer the quiet child people once whispered about. At 17 years old, she had grown into a young woman known for her intelligence, wit, and sharp observations about the world around her. Yet in the social circles of the Southern elite, those qualities were not always the most important ones. What mattered more were family connections, reputation, and marriage. In towns and plantations across Mississippi, gatherings and celebrations often served another purpose. Beyond entertainment, they were opportunities for young men and women from prominent families to meet potential spouses. One such gathering took place during the Christmas season of 1843 at Hurricane Plantation, the home of a well-known Mississippi family. Among the guests that evening was a man who immediately stood out. His name was Jefferson Davis. Unlike the other young men who might attend such parties, Davis already carried the reputation of someone who had lived an eventful life. At the time, he was 35 years old, nearly 18 years older than Verina. He had served as an officer in the U.S. Army and had recently established himself as a wealthy plantation owner. But what made him even more intriguing was the tragedy in his past. Several years earlier, Davis had been married to Sarah Knox Taylor, the daughter of Zachary Taylor, a respected U.S. Army general who would later become the 12th President of the United States. Their marriage in 1835 had been brief and controversial, largely because Sarah's father disapproved of the match. Just 3 months after their wedding, Sarah fell ill, most likely from malaria, and died. Her death devastated Davis. For years afterward, he withdrew from public life, spending much of his time in isolation at his plantation. Friends and acquaintances described him as a man deeply marked by grief, someone who had struggled to recover from the loss. By the time he arrived at the Christmas gathering in 1843, Davis had slowly begun returning to society. And that night, he met Verina Howell. According to later accounts, the meeting left a strong impression on both of them. Verina was young, but remarkably articulate and confident. Davis, despite his reserved nature, was drawn to her intelligence and lively conversation. Yet their connection immediately raised eyebrows among those who knew them. The age difference alone was striking. More importantly, Davis had already experienced the pain of losing a wife, and many people wondered whether he was truly ready to begin another relationship. Others questioned whether a young woman like Verina, educated in the North and known for independent thinking, would be suited to the life of a Southern planter's wife. But the two continued to see one another. What had begun as a chance meeting at a Christmas celebration soon developed into a courtship that would shape both of their futures. For Verina Howell, the encounter seemed almost romantic, a charismatic older man with experience, ambition, and influence. For Jefferson Davis, it was something more complicated, because although he was clearly drawn to Verina, the memory of his first wife had never fully disappeared, and that lingering shadow would follow them into their marriage. After their first meeting during the Christmas gathering of 1843, the connection between Verina Howell and Jefferson Davis did not fade. Instead, it quietly grew over the following months as the two continued to see one another through visits, social gatherings, and correspondence. In the world of Southern high society, courtship was rarely a private matter. Families observed closely, friends formed opinions, and reputations could influence the outcome of a relationship long before a proposal was ever made. From the beginning, many people around Verina were uncertain about the match. Her parents, William and Margaret Howell, were particularly cautious. Jefferson Davis was not just older, he was nearly 2 decades her senior. At 35, he had already lived a life that included military service, political ambitions, and the devastating loss of a wife. Verina, on the other hand, had only just returned home from school. The difference in age and life experience worried her family. They also wondered about Davis's personality. He was known to be intelligent and disciplined, but also serious, sometimes rigid, and deeply shaped by his past grief. Some people feared that a marriage to such a man might be difficult for a young woman still discovering her own place in the world, yet the courtship continued. Despite the concerns around them, Verina found Davis fascinating. He possessed a commanding presence and spoke passionately about politics, the future of the South, and his ambitions for public life. Conversations with him were rarely dull, and his experience made him seem worldly compared to the young men she had previously known. Davis, in turn, admired Verina's education and sharp mind. She was not simply polite or charming, she could discuss literature, politics, and society with confidence. For a man who moved within intellectual and political circles, that quality was appealing. Still, the relationship moved forward cautiously. For much of 1844, the two remained in contact while the question of marriage slowly approached. Friends and family watched carefully, waiting to see whether the courtship would end quietly or lead to something more serious. Eventually, Jefferson Davis made his intentions clear. He proposed marriage. At first, Verina's parents hesitated. Their earlier concerns had not disappeared, but Davis's social standing, wealth, and growing political influence made him an attractive match in the eyes of many Southern families. After some deliberation, they agreed to give their consent. Plans began for what was originally intended to be a grand wedding celebration, the kind expected when two respected Southern families joined together. But in the end, the ceremony would be far more modest than anyone initially imagined. And even before the marriage officially began, subtle signs were already appearing that life with Jefferson Davis might not be as simple as Verina expected. Because while Davis was ready to build a future with a new wife, the memory of the woman he had lost years earlier was never far from his mind. In February 1845, the long courtship between Verina Howell and Jefferson Davis finally came to an end. They were married at the Howell family home in Mississippi. Originally, the wedding had been planned as a large and elegant event, the kind expected when two prominent Southern families joined together. But for reasons that were never fully explained, the ceremony became far smaller than first imagined. Only a limited circle of Verina's relatives and close friends attended. One detail stood out immediately. None of Jefferson Davis's family members were present. Their absence was unusual and did not go unnoticed. Weddings in Southern society were typically gatherings where extended families celebrated together, reinforcing alliances between powerful households. Yet on that day, the Davis family was missing from the room. Whether this reflected lingering tensions, personal disagreements, or simply distance is still debated by historians. But for Verina, it was the first subtle sign that her marriage might carry complexities she had not fully anticipated. At just 18 years old, she was now the wife of a man whose life experiences were far deeper and more complicated than her own. Not long after the ceremony, the newlyweds began their life together. They traveled briefly before settling at Briarfield Plantation, the estate Jefferson Davis had established in Mississippi. The plantation itself stood on land originally owned by Davis's older brother, Joseph Davis, who had helped him start his agricultural enterprise. Life at Briarfield represented the traditional role expected of a Southern planter's wife. Verina was responsible for overseeing the household, managing domestic affairs, and maintaining the social reputation of the family. These duties were demanding but familiar within the culture of the Southern elite. Yet very quickly, she began to notice something about her husband that made her uneasy. Jefferson Davis held deeply traditional views about gender roles. Although Verina had received a sophisticated education and was accustomed to intellectual conversation, Davis expected his wife to focus primarily on the domestic sphere. In his mind, the ideal Southern wife was loyal, supportive, and devoted to home and family rather than public debate. For someone as educated and thoughtful as Verina, the adjustment was difficult. But there was another emotional challenge as well, one that lingered quietly between them. the memory of Sarah Knox Taylor, Davis's first wife. Her death had devastated him years earlier, and despite his efforts to move forward, the past had not entirely faded. Verina would later admit that she sometimes felt like she was living in the shadow of a woman who had died long before she ever met her husband. Even their honeymoon carried a reminder of that history. During their travels, Davis took Verina to visit his elderly mother, but he also stopped at a place that surprised his new bride, the grave of Sarah Knox Taylor. For Verina, the moment was uncomfortable and revealing. It showed just how deeply the memory of Davis's first marriage still shaped his life. And as their new life together at Briarfield began, Verina slowly realized that marriage to Jefferson Davis would require patience, resilience, and an ability to navigate a past that never fully disappeared. What she could not yet know was that their quiet plantation life would soon change dramatically, because within a few years, Jefferson Davis would step onto the national political stage, and that decision would pull both of them into the center of American history. Only a year after their marriage, the quiet life that Verina Davis had begun at Briarfield Plantation changed dramatically. In 1846, Jefferson Davis was elected to the United States House of Representatives as a representative from Mississippi. The victory marked the beginning of what would become a long and influential political career. For Verina, the election meant leaving behind the isolated world of plantation life. She would now accompany her husband to Washington, D.C., the center of American politics. At the time, Washington was still a relatively small city compared to modern standards, but it was rapidly becoming the heart of national debate. Politicians, diplomats, military officers, journalists, and social elites gathered there from every corner of the country. For Verina, the move opened the door to an entirely new environment. Unlike the rigid plantation culture of Mississippi, Washington society was lively and intellectually active. Political discussions took place at dinners, in private salons, and during endless social gatherings that filled the city's calendar. Surprisingly, Verina adapted to this world with remarkable ease. Though still very young, she quickly became known as one of the most charming and intelligent hostesses in Washington society. Her education, confidence, and ability to hold thoughtful conversations made her stand out among many women of the time. Visitors often commented on her wit and the sharp observations she made during discussions about politics and culture. In fact, many people who met Verina during these early Washington years believed she possessed a political awareness that rivaled that of many men around her. The Capitol seemed to suit her perfectly. She enjoyed the lively social life, the intellectual stimulation, and the opportunity to interact with people from across the country. For someone who had once studied in Philadelphia and experienced the energy of a northern city, Washington felt familiar in a way that Mississippi never had. But while Verina was thriving in the capital, events beyond her control were about to interrupt their life once again. In 1846, the United States entered a conflict that would draw Jefferson Davis away from politics and back into the military world he once knew. The Mexican-American War had begun. Driven by a strong sense of duty and ambition, Davis made a decision that would temporarily end his time in Congress. He resigned his seat and volunteered to serve in the war. Once again, Verina found herself facing the uncertainty that often accompanied life as the wife of a man devoted to public service. Her husband was leaving Washington to lead soldiers into battle, and she would soon discover that political ambition and the wars surrounding it could place enormous strain on a marriage. When the Mexican-American War erupted in 1846, Jefferson Davis did not hesitate for long. Although he had just begun his career in the United States Congress, his background as a former Army officer and his strong sense of honor pushed him toward the battlefield once again. He resigned from the House of Representatives and volunteered for military service. Davis soon became the colonel of the Mississippi Rifles, a volunteer regiment that would gain a reputation for discipline and courage during the war. Under his command, the unit fought in several key battles, including the famous Battle of Buena Vista in 1847, where Davis earned national attention for his leadership and bravery. For Jefferson Davis, the war was an opportunity. Military success could strengthen his political future and elevate his standing across the country. Victories on the battlefield often translated into influence in Washington, and Davis understood that well. But while his reputation was growing, Verina Davis faced a very different reality. With her husband away at war, she spent long periods separated from him, navigating the uncertainty that came with military conflict. Letters became their primary connection, carrying news from distant battlefields and glimpses of the life he was living far from home. For Verina, these months reinforced something she had already begun to sense about her marriage. Jefferson Davis was a man driven by duty, ambition, and strong convictions. His life revolved around public service, politics, and military honor. Personal comfort or domestic peace rarely came first. When the war finally ended in 1848, Davis returned home not only as a respected officer, but also as a man whose political future looked brighter than ever. He soon re-entered national politics, first returning to public life and later rising through the ranks of government. Over the next several years, he would serve as a U.S. Senator from Mississippi and later as Secretary of War in the administration of President Franklin Pierce. This meant that Verina and her husband would spend much of their lives divided between Mississippi and Washington, D.C. On the surface, their life appeared successful. Davis's influence continued to grow, and the couple moved within powerful political circles. Yet beneath that success, subtle tensions were beginning to form. One of the most significant differences between them involved their views on slavery and the future of the United States. Jefferson Davis strongly defended the Southern system of plantation agriculture and the institution of slavery that supported it. Like many Southern politicians of his era, he believed the system was both economically necessary and socially justified. Verina, however, had been shaped by her education in the North. She had been exposed to different ideas about society and human freedom. While she did not openly challenge her husband in public, her private thoughts were often more complex than those of many Southern women around her. At times, the contrast between their perspectives created quiet disagreements within the marriage. Still, the relationship endured. For Verina, loyalty to her husband remained important, even when their views did not always align. But the years ahead would test that loyalty in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Because while Jefferson Davis's political power was steadily rising, the United States itself was moving toward a crisis that would soon divide the entire nation. During the 1850s, the public life of Jefferson Davis continued to grow stronger. His influence in Washington expanded, and his reputation as a powerful Southern politician became firmly established. He served for years as a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, and in 1853, he was appointed Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. For many families, such success would have been a time of celebration and stability. But inside the Davis household, those same years brought both joy and devastating loss. Between 1852 and 1864, Verina and Jefferson Davis would have 6 children together, 4 sons and 2 daughters. Each birth brought hope to the family, yet the era in which they lived was one where childhood survival was never guaranteed. Their first child, Samuel Emory Davis, was born in 1852. Like many new parents, Jefferson and Verina were filled with excitement and pride. But their happiness, the loss, shattered Verina. The death of a young child was heartbreakingly common in the 19th century, but knowing that others experienced the same pain did little to soften the grief. For a time, Verina withdrew from many of the social activities she had once enjoyed in Washington. Her world became quieter. In 1855, the couple welcomed their second child, a daughter named Margaret. Unlike most of her siblings, Margaret would survive into adulthood, eventually marrying and starting a family of her own. For Verina, Margaret became a source of comfort during years that would otherwise be filled with sorrow. A third child, Jefferson Davis Jr., was born in 1857. He would live much longer than Samuel but would still die young, passing away at the age of 21 during a yellow fever epidemic in 1878. Two more sons followed: Joseph Davis, born in 1859, and William Davis, born in 1861, both died in childhood. The repeated tragedies left deep emotional scars on the family, especially on Verina, who experienced the grief of losing child after child during the most turbulent years of American history. Finally, in 1864, their youngest child was born. Her name was Verina Davis, but she would later become widely known by the nickname Winnie. Winnie would grow especially close to her mother, and during the final years of the Civil War, she would even become a symbolic figure in the South. Many newspapers began referring to her as the daughter of the Confederacy. But when she was born, the country was already engulfed in war, and the Davis family itself stood at the center of that conflict. Because by the early 1860s, the political tensions that had been growing between the northern and southern states for decades were about to explode into open war. Within a short time, Jefferson Davis would rise to a position no one in the family could have predicted. He would become the president of a brand new nation. And Verina Davis, who had once been a young girl surrounded by whispers in Mississippi, would suddenly find herself the First Lady of the Confederacy, watched and judged by an entire country. By the late 1850s, the United States was no longer a country quietly debating its future. The divisions between the northern and southern states had grown so deep that many people believed the nation could not remain united much longer. At the center of this growing conflict was a single issue that had haunted American politics for decades: slavery. The northern states were changing rapidly. Their economies were becoming more industrial, filled with factories, railroads, and expanding cities. Many of these states had already abolished slavery or were moving steadily in that direction. The South was different. Its economy still depended heavily on agriculture, especially the massive production of cotton and tobacco. These crops were cultivated on large plantations that relied on the forced labor of enslaved people. For Southern planters, slavery was not only a labor system, it was the foundation of their wealth and social power. This difference created a political and moral divide that grew more intense every year. As the United States expanded westward, a crucial question emerged again and again. Would new territories allow slavery or forbid it? Every new state entering the Union threatened to shift the balance of power between North and South in Congress. By the 1850s, the issue had become explosive. Violent clashes broke out in places like Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought openly for control of the territory. Newspapers across the country fueled anger and fear, portraying the other side as a threat to the nation's future. New political movements also emerged. In the North, the Republican Party was formed in the mid-1850s with a platform strongly opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories. Many Southern leaders saw this as a direct attack on their economic system and their way of life. Among those Southern leaders was Jefferson Davis. By this time, Davis had become one of the most prominent political voices defending the Southern states. He argued that slavery was protected by the Constitution and that the federal government had no right to interfere with it. For him, the issue was not only about economics but also about states' rights and the autonomy of Southern society. Inside the Davis household, however, the situation was more complicated. Verina Davis had spent years living in both the North and the South. Her education in Philadelphia had exposed her to very different opinions about slavery and human equality. While she rarely challenged her husband publicly, she often viewed the growing conflict with a sense of unease. She understood the South's perspective, yet she could also see how deeply the country was dividing. In later years, she would describe herself as someone who felt connected to both regions of the country. But history was moving quickly. In November 1860, the political tension that had been building for decades reached a breaking point when Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. Although Lincoln had not promised to abolish slavery immediately, Southern leaders believed his victory represented a future where their influence would steadily disappear. Within weeks, the first dramatic step toward disunion occurred. In December 1860, the state of South Carolina announced that it was seceding from the United States. It would not be the last. And within months, Jefferson Davis and his family would find themselves at the center of a political storm that would change their lives forever. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 sent shockwaves through the Southern states. Many political leaders in the South believed the balance of power in Washington had shifted permanently against them. Even though Lincoln had not promised to abolish slavery immediately, the fear that his administration might eventually weaken the institution was enough to trigger drastic action. Within weeks, the first step toward breaking the Union was taken. On the 20th of December 1860, South Carolina formally declared that it was leaving the United States. The announcement stunned the nation, but it also inspired other Southern states that shared the same concerns. Over the next several months, a chain reaction unfolded. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon followed South Carolina's lead, announcing their own decisions to secede from the Union. These states believed that forming a new government was the only way to protect their political power and economic system. For Jefferson Davis, the moment carried enormous personal and political significance. At the time, he was serving as a United States Senator from Mississippi in Washington, D.C. Like many Southern politicians, he had spent years arguing that the federal government should not interfere with the rights of individual states. Now his own state had chosen to leave the Union. On the 9th of January 1861, Mississippi officially voted to secede. Only 12 days later, Jefferson Davis stood before the Senate and delivered a farewell speech. In calm but solemn words, he announced that he was resigning from the United States Congress. After years of serving the federal government, he was now leaving it behind. Davis returned to the South uncertain about what would happen next. At the time, he did not necessarily expect to become the leader of the new nation that was forming, but events moved quickly. In February 1861, representatives from the seceding states gathered in Montgomery, Alabama, to establish a new government called the Confederate States of America. They needed someone to lead this fragile alliance, a man who had political experience, military background, and respect across the South. Many eyes turned toward Jefferson Davis. He had served in Congress, fought in war, and held the position of Secretary of War. Among Southern leaders, he was considered disciplined, experienced, and capable of commanding authority. Soon after arriving in Montgomery, Davis received news that would transform his life forever. He had been elected provisional president of the Confederate States of America. The announcement surprised even him. When he accepted the position, he reportedly spoke with a mixture of pride and concern, recognizing that the responsibility ahead would be enormous. For Verina Davis, the news meant that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Almost overnight, she had become the First Lady of an entirely new nation. But unlike many women who proudly embraced such a role, Verina carried private doubts about the path the South had chosen. Those doubts would soon place her in a difficult position, because while her husband now stood at the head of the Confederacy, the war that would define their lives was only just beginning. When Jefferson Davis was chosen as the provisional president of the Confederate States of America in February 1861, the newly formed government was still uncertain about its future. The Southern states had declared independence from the United States, but the structure of their new nation was fragile and untested. At first, the Confederate capital was established in Montgomery, Alabama, where political leaders worked quickly to create a government, organize an army, and prepare for the conflict they believed was inevitable. For Verina Davis, the change was sudden and overwhelming. Only weeks earlier, she had been living the life of a politician's wife. Now she found herself thrust into a far more visible position, the First Lady of the Confederacy. Unlike the role of First Lady in Washington, however, this position came with enormous pressure and uncertainty. The Confederate government was fighting for its survival from the very beginning, and its leaders knew that public morale would play a crucial role in the war effort. As the president's wife, Verina was expected to become a symbol of Southern strength and dignity. Soon after Davis took office, the Confederate capital was moved to Richmond, Virginia, a city closer to the front lines of the coming war. Richmond quickly transformed into the political and military center of the Confederacy. In the city's social circles, Verina became a highly visible figure. She hosted gatherings, received political guests, and represented the Confederate leadership at formal events. Many people admired her intelligence and calm demeanor, qualities that helped her navigate the intense social atmosphere surrounding the Confederate government. But privately, Verina struggled with the role she had been given. Unlike many Southern leaders who were passionate supporters of the Confederacy, she had never fully embraced the idea of breaking away from the United States. Her education and experiences in the North had left her with a more complicated view of the country's divisions. She once admitted that she did not truly believe the Confederacy could succeed in the long run. These private doubts made her position extremely difficult. As the First Lady, she was expected to speak positively about the Confederate cause, encourage morale among civilians and soldiers, and present a confident image to the public. At the same time, she was dealing with personal challenges. During the war years, Verina spent long periods pregnant, caring for young children, and coping with the constant stress of political life. The capital city of Richmond was crowded with soldiers, government officials, and refugees from the war. Food shortages, rising prices, and military news from the front created an atmosphere of tension that never fully disappeared. And as if these pressures were not enough, another problem began to grow around her. The rumors that had followed Verina since childhood, those whispers about her dark features and possible mixed ancestry, began spreading again. But now the whispers were no longer quiet. They were appearing in newspapers, and the attacks were about to become far more vicious than anything she had faced before. By the early years of the American Civil War, Richmond had become a city filled with tension. Soldiers marched through the streets daily, hospitals overflowed with wounded men, and political leaders argued constantly over how to sustain the Confederate war effort. But inside the presidential residence, another battle was quietly unfolding. It wasn't fought with guns or armies, it was fought with rumors. As the war intensified, critics of Jefferson Davis began searching for ways to weaken his authority. Some accused him of poor military leadership. Others blamed him for shortages of food and supplies across the South. Yet a more personal and cruel line of attack soon appeared. Instead of targeting the president directly, newspapers and political enemies began targeting his wife, Verina Davis. And the weapon they chose was scandal. Whispers about Verina's appearance had circulated quietly for years. People sometimes commented on her dark hair, her complexion, or the shape of her features. In the deeply racialized society of the 1800s American South, even small differences in appearance could spark suspicion. Those suspicions now turned into malicious stories. Certain newspapers began hinting, sometimes subtly, sometimes openly, that the Confederate First Lady might have African ancestry. In the Confederate South, where slavery and racial hierarchy formed the foundation of society, such accusations were explosive. Even suggesting that the president's wife might be mixed race was meant to be devastating. Union newspapers in the North quickly noticed the rumors spreading through the South and amplified them further. Political cartoonists and journalists used the gossip to embarrass the Confederate leadership. To them, it was an opportunity for propaganda. If the Confederacy claimed to defend racial purity and the institution of slavery, what would it mean if its president's own wife supposedly had African heritage? The irony was too tempting for Northern critics to ignore. Soon, satirical cartoons and mocking articles began appearing in newspapers across cities like New York City and Philadelphia. Some of these publications portrayed the Confederate leadership in humiliating ways, suggesting hypocrisy at the highest level of the Southern government. For Verina, the attacks were deeply painful. She had always understood that political life involved criticism, but these accusations were different. They were personal, cruel, and rooted in the racial prejudices of the era. Worse still, there was almost nothing she could do to defend herself. Publicly responding to such rumors would only draw more attention to them. Remaining silent, however, allowed the gossip to spread unchecked. Inside the Confederate capital, the whispers began circulating among elite social circles. At formal dinners and gatherings, people smiled politely at the First Lady, but behind closed doors, some repeated the same ugly question: was the wife of the Confederate president hiding a secret about her ancestry? And as the war continued, the rumors would grow even louder and far more dangerous. At first, the rumors surrounding Verina Davis moved quietly through social circles in Richmond. Conversations behind closed doors, whispered comments at dinners, subtle glances during formal receptions. But in the middle of the American Civil War, rumors had a way of becoming something far more powerful. They became propaganda. Newspapers across the Union realized that attacking the personal life of Jefferson Davis could damage his public image. Military battles were being fought on the front lines, but another war was unfolding in print, one fought with satire, mockery, and scandal. Northern newspapers began publishing articles that hinted at a shocking claim that the Confederate First Lady might secretly be of mixed racial ancestry. Some writers didn't state the accusation directly. Instead, they used sarcasm and carefully chosen language, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. Others were far less subtle. Cartoonists began producing exaggerated illustrations that mocked the Confederate leadership. These cartoons appeared in popular publications throughout cities like Boston, New York City, and Chicago. The goal was simple: embarrass the Confederacy and undermine its claims of racial superiority. For readers in the North, the story carried a dark sense of irony. The Confederate government defended slavery and strict racial divisions, yet its president was now being mocked with the suggestion that his own household might violate those very ideals. But the situation was even more complicated. Many Southern newspapers were furious about the rumors. Editors in Confederate states rushed to defend the honor of their First Lady, publishing articles that rejected the accusations as lies created by Union propaganda. They described Verina as a respectable Southern woman from a proper family and accused Northern journalists of spreading deliberate slander. Yet even these defenses had an unintended effect. By publicly denying the rumors, they kept the story alive. Every new article meant more readers hearing about the accusation for the first time. Soon, the gossip reached ordinary citizens across both the North and South. Soldiers in camp read about it in newspapers. Politicians discussed it privately, social elites debated it quietly during dinners and gatherings, and at the center of it all was a woman who had never asked to become a political symbol. Inside the Confederate White House, Verina Davis continued carrying out her duties, hosting visitors, supporting wounded soldiers, and managing her family during wartime. But the whispers never completely disappeared, because in a society built on rigid ideas of race and identity, even a hint of scandal could follow someone forever. And for the Confederate First Lady, the worst part of the story was still to come. Inside the Confederate Executive Mansion in Richmond, the outside world often felt like it was pressing in from every direction. News from battlefields arrived daily. Reports of casualties filled the newspapers. Supplies were shrinking, and the Confederate government faced growing criticism. Yet amid all those national crises, a deeply personal storm was quietly surrounding the household of Jefferson Davis. The rumors about Verina Davis refused to disappear. Servants in the household occasionally overheard gossip carried by visitors. Political guests sometimes spoke carefully around her, as if uncertain what to believe. Even among Confederate supporters, the whispers had begun to circulate. Verina understood exactly what those rumors meant. In the society of the 1800s American South, racial identity was treated as something absolute. Laws and customs created strict divisions between people of different backgrounds, and even the smallest suggestion of mixed ancestry could destroy a person's reputation. For a private citizen, the accusation could be humiliating. For the wife of the Confederate president, it could be politically devastating. Yet Verina chose not to confront the rumors publicly. Part of her silence came from necessity. If she addressed the accusations directly, it might make the scandal even larger. Newspapers in both the North and South would seize on any statement she made, printing and reprinting her words until the story dominated headlines. But there was another reason for her restraint. Verina had always been uncomfortable with the intense political culture surrounding her husband's leadership. Even before the war, she had sometimes expressed doubts about the future of the Southern cause. Now, as the American Civil War dragged on, those doubts only grew stronger. The war was costing thousands of lives. Cities were suffering from shortages of food and medicine. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers. And in the middle of that national crisis, newspapers were attacking her identity. Friends later recalled that Verina handled the situation with remarkable composure. In public gatherings, she remained calm and dignified. She continued hosting receptions and speaking politely with guests, never showing anger or fear. But privately, the pressure weighed heavily on her. She worried about her children, about the future of her family, and about the fate of the Confederacy itself. She also understood that no matter how carefully she behaved, the rumors might never completely disappear. Because once a scandal enters the world of politics, it develops a life of its own. And as the war continued to grow more brutal, the personal attacks on the Confederate leadership, including its First Lady, were about to become even more intense. By 1863, the tide of the American Civil War was beginning to shift. What many Confederate leaders had once believed would be a short conflict had turned into a brutal, grinding war. Battles stretched across the South, and the Confederacy was slowly losing resources, soldiers, and hope. Nowhere was that pressure felt more strongly than in Richmond, the capital of the Confederate government. The city had transformed dramatically since the war began. Hospitals filled entire buildings. Factories worked day and night producing weapons and supplies. Long lines of civilians waited for food as shortages grew worse with each passing month. For the family of Jefferson Davis, life inside the Confederate Executive Mansion had become increasingly tense. Every day brought reports from the front lines. Some messages delivered hopeful news, Confederate victories that briefly lifted the mood of the capital. But more often, the reports described devastating losses. Entire regiments wiped out, cities under threat, railroads destroyed. And each military failure brought louder criticism of the Confederate president. Opponents accused Davis of poor leadership. Newspapers debated his decisions. Political rivals questioned whether he could guide the Confederacy through such a desperate war. Once again, the personal lives of the presidential family became part of the conversation. For Verina Davis, the role she had reluctantly accepted was becoming more difficult by the day. She continued visiting hospitals, comforting wounded soldiers, and organizing charitable efforts for families affected by the war. But the emotional cost was immense. One of the most devastating moments came in 1864 when tragedy struck her own family. Her young son, Joseph, suffered a fatal accident at the Confederate White House, falling from a balcony. The loss shattered Verina. Friends later wrote that the grief nearly destroyed her spirit. In the middle of a nation collapsing under the weight of war, she was now facing a deeply personal heartbreak, yet the outside world showed little mercy. Political critics continued attacking her husband. Union newspapers continued mocking the Confederate leadership, and the rumors about Verina's ancestry still appeared from time to time, used as yet another way to ridicule the government in Richmond. But by this point, the scandal was beginning to matter less. Because something far larger was approaching. Union armies were advancing deeper into Confederate territory. Cities were falling, supply lines were breaking apart, and the capital of the Confederacy itself was beginning to look dangerously exposed. Within 2 years, the government led by Jefferson Davis would collapse completely, and the life of the Confederate First Lady would change forever. By early 1865, the situation for the Confederate States of America had become desperate. Union armies were advancing from multiple directions, and the once confident leadership in Richmond could no longer hide the truth. The war was being lost. For months, the capital had lived under constant fear of attack. The powerful Union Army led by Ulysses S. Grant was slowly tightening its grip around the Confederate defenses. Supply routes were collapsing, and the Confederate Army was running dangerously low on food, ammunition, and fresh troops. Inside the executive mansion, Jefferson Davis faced the reality that his government might soon have to abandon the capital. On the night of the 2nd of April, 1865, that moment finally arrived. A message from the battlefield reached Davis during a church service. Confederate General Robert E. Lee warned that the defensive lines protecting Richmond could no longer hold against Union forces. The capital had to be evacuated immediately. Within hours, government officials rushed through the darkened streets, gathering documents and preparing to flee the city. Military officers organized the destruction of supplies that could not be carried away, hoping to prevent them from falling into Union hands. For Verina Davis, the evacuation was chaotic and frightening. She had already endured years of war, public criticism, and personal tragedy. Now she was forced to pack what remained of her family's belongings and prepare to escape a city that might soon become a battlefield. During the night, fires began spreading across Richmond as warehouses and government facilities were deliberately burned. Explosions echoed through the streets as Confederate troops destroyed ammunition depots. By the time dawn arrived, thick smoke covered much of the city. Verina and her children were placed on a train leaving Richmond, heading south toward uncertain safety. It would be the last time she would ever see the Confederate capital as the First Lady. The next morning, Union troops marched into Richmond and raised the United States flag over the city. The Confederate government was now a government on the run. Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis fled separately, attempting to keep the collapsing Confederacy alive by relocating its leadership farther south. But the effort was already doomed. Within weeks, the Confederate military would surrender, and the man who had once led a nation would soon become one of the most famous prisoners in America. After fleeing the burning capital of Richmond in April 1865, the leaders of the collapsing Confederate States of America scattered across the South. Their hope was to regroup somewhere farther away from Union armies and continue resisting. But in reality, the Confederacy was already finished. Just days after Richmond fell, the Confederate Army, led by Robert E. Lee, surrendered to Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. Surrender. The surrender effectively ended the largest Confederate military force. For Jefferson Davis, however, surrender was not immediate. He continued traveling south with a small group of officials, moving through North Carolina, South Carolina, and eventually into Georgia. Along the way, he hoped to rally remaining Confederate troops and establish a new base of resistance. But the plan quickly unraveled. Union cavalry units were actively searching for him. Federal leaders believed capturing the Confederate president would send a powerful message that the rebellion had truly ended. Meanwhile, Verina Davis and her children were also traveling south, though on a separate route. The family's situation had become increasingly dangerous. Roads were crowded with refugees, soldiers, and government officials all fleeing the same collapsing government. Food was scarce. Travel was exhausting. At times, Verina reportedly feared that her family might be captured or attacked at any moment. Eventually, she reunited briefly with her husband during the chaotic escape, but their reunion would not last long. On the 10th of May, 1865, Union soldiers finally located Jefferson Davis's camp near Irwinville. Before dawn, Federal cavalry surrounded the area and moved in. Accounts of what happened next would later become famous and controversial. Some Union newspapers claimed that Davis had tried to escape disguised in women's clothing, a story that spread quickly across the country and was widely mocked. Historians later debated the accuracy of that claim, suggesting it was exaggerated or misunderstood. But at the time, the story became a powerful piece of wartime propaganda. What mattered most was that the Confederate president had been captured. Jefferson Davis was arrested and taken into federal custody, becoming the highest-ranking Confederate leader to fall into Union hands. For Verina, the news was devastating. The war had taken her home, her nation, and one of her children. Now it had taken her husband as well. And the former First Lady of the Confederacy was about to face a completely different life, one defined not by power or politics, but by survival in a country that had just defeated everything her husband had fought for. After his capture in Irwinville in May 1865, Jefferson Davis was placed under heavy guard by Union soldiers. For the United States government, he was not just another defeated leader. He was the man who had presided over 4 years of rebellion during the American Civil War. Many in the North demanded that he be punished severely. Some politicians even called for him to be executed for treason. The Union government decided to imprison him while officials debated what to do next. Davis was transported under military escort to Fort Monroe, a massive coastal fortress controlled by Union forces. There, he would be held as a prisoner of the United States. The conditions of his imprisonment quickly became controversial. At first, Davis was placed in a small, heavily guarded room and kept under constant watch. For a period of time, he was even shackled with leg irons, a decision that angered many of his supporters. Union authorities feared that Confederate loyalists might attempt to rescue him, but the harsh treatment created sympathy for him in parts of the country, especially among former Confederates who believed their leader was being humiliated unnecessarily. Meanwhile, far away from the prison walls, Verina Davis was struggling to rebuild what remained of her life. The collapse of the Confederacy had left her family nearly destitute. The political power and social influence they once possessed had vanished almost overnight. Properties were lost, money was scarce, and the future was uncertain. Even traveling safely through the defeated South was difficult. For months, Verina focused on protecting her children and finding a place where they could live quietly while Jefferson Davis remained imprisoned. She wrote letters, sought assistance from friends, and tried to maintain hope that her husband might eventually be released. But the political situation was complicated. In Washington, government leaders debated whether putting Davis on trial might reopen the wounds of the Civil War. Prosecuting him for treason could trigger intense legal and political conflicts between North and South. So while politicians argued over his fate, Jefferson Davis remained locked inside Fort Monroe, and Verina waited. The woman who had once hosted diplomats and generals in the Confederate capital was now simply a wife trying to keep her family together while the entire country argued about what should be done with her imprisoned husband. While Jefferson Davis remained imprisoned at Fort Monroe, his wife, Verina Davis, faced a completely different struggle learning how to survive in a country that had just defeated everything her family had stood for. The end of the American Civil War left much of the South economically devastated. Cities were damaged, farms destroyed, and entire communities were struggling with poverty. Former Confederate families who once held wealth and influence suddenly found themselves without financial security. The Davis family was no exception. Without Jefferson Davis free to support the household, Verina had to rely heavily on friends and sympathizers who still respected the former Confederate leader. Some supporters quietly raised money to help her care for her children while she waited for news about her husband's fate. But even in defeat, the Davis name still attracted attention. Newspapers across the United States continued writing about the captured Confederate president and his family. Some Northern publications remained openly hostile, blaming him for the war and the suffering it caused. Others began debating whether keeping him imprisoned would only prolong the bitterness between North and South. Meanwhile, Verina tried to maintain dignity despite the difficult circumstances. She wrote letters regularly to Jefferson Davis at Fort Monroe. These letters often carried updates about their children, small details about daily life, and expressions of encouragement. Although prison authorities monitored their correspondence, the letters became one of the few ways the couple could stay emotionally connected. Visitors who met Verina during this time later described her as calm and thoughtful, even while facing enormous uncertainty. Yet the weight of public attention never fully disappeared. The rumors that had once surrounded her during the war, those cruel accusations about her appearance and supposed ancestry, occasionally resurfaced in newspapers or gossip columns. But by the late 1860s, they no longer carried the same explosive political power. The Confederacy was gone. The political world that had once turned those rumors into weapons had disappeared along with it. Now, the larger question facing the country was not about scandal, but about reconciliation. The United States government needed to decide how to rebuild the nation after 4 years of civil war, and that decision would determine the fate of the most famous Confederate prisoner still sitting behind the walls of Fort Monroe. After nearly 2 years of imprisonment at Fort Monroe, the future of Jefferson Davis was still unclear. The United States government had arrested him on suspicion of treason for leading the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War. But putting him on trial was far more complicated than many politicians had expected. Some leaders in Washington wanted a dramatic courtroom trial that would prove the Confederacy had committed a crime against the United States. Others feared the opposite, that such a trial might reopen the deep wounds of the war and prolong national division. There was also a legal concern. If Davis were tried in court, his lawyers might argue that the Southern states had the constitutional right to leave the Union. A lengthy legal battle over that question could create enormous political controversy during the already fragile Reconstruction era. So the government delayed. Month after month, Jefferson Davis remained imprisoned while lawyers and politicians debated the risks of bringing him to trial. During that time, Verina Davis continued fighting for her husband's release. She wrote letters, appealed to influential friends, and quietly encouraged supporters who believed that keeping Davis in prison would only deepen the bitterness between North and South. Gradually, public opinion began to shift. Even some Northerners who had strongly opposed the Confederacy began to question whether holding the former president indefinitely served any real purpose. The country was trying to rebuild after a devastating war, and many people believed reconciliation required moving forward rather than continuing to punish former enemies. Finally, in 1867, Jefferson Davis was released on bail. Several prominent figures, including wealthy Northern businessmen, helped guarantee the large financial bond required for his freedom. The decision surprised many Americans, but it reflected a growing desire to reduce tensions between the former Union and Confederate States. For the first time since his capture, Davis was no longer a prisoner, yet freedom came with limitations. He was still officially under indictment for treason, meaning the possibility of a future trial remained. His political influence had largely disappeared, and he was now living in a country that had decisively rejected the government he once led. For Verina, however, the moment meant something deeply personal. After years of war, escape, imprisonment, and uncertainty, her family was finally reunited. But the life waiting for them outside the prison walls would be nothing like the one they had known before the war. When Jefferson Davis walked free on bail in 1867, the world he returned to was almost unrecognizable. The Confederate States of America no longer existed. The American Civil War had ended 2 years earlier, leaving the Southern states politically defeated and economically shattered. And the man who had once led that government was now simply a private citizen again. For Verina Davis, the reunion with her husband brought relief, but it also marked the beginning of a difficult new chapter. The Davis family had lost nearly everything. Their political power had vanished, their finances were unstable, and the reputation of Jefferson Davis remained deeply controversial across the country. Many Americans still blamed him for the rebellion that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Rebuilding their life would not be easy. At first, the family moved frequently, searching for stability and financial security. Friends and former Confederate supporters occasionally offered assistance, but opportunities were limited. Businesses were hesitant to associate themselves with the former president of the Confederacy, fearing political backlash. Jefferson Davis also remained under the shadow of the unresolved treason charges against him. Technically, the United States government could still put him on trial at any time. The legal case dragged on for years, creating uncertainty about whether the former Confederate leader might once again face imprisonment. Eventually, however, the political mood of the country began to change. Reconstruction policies were slowly reshaping the South, and many leaders in Washington believed it was time to move forward rather than continue punishing former Confederate officials. In 1869, the government quietly dropped the case against Jefferson Davis. He would never stand trial. The decision effectively closed one of the most controversial legal questions left over from the Civil War. But freedom did not restore the Davis family's former status. Jefferson Davis struggled to find steady employment and spent several years attempting to rebuild his reputation through writing and public speaking. He began working on memoirs about the Confederacy, determined to defend the decisions he had made during the war. Meanwhile, Verina faced a different kind of challenge. She had spent years as a political figure, hosting leaders and diplomats in the Confederate capital of Richmond. Now she was adapting to a quieter life, far removed from the halls of power. Yet in many ways, this new life would eventually give her something she had rarely experienced before: independence. And in the decades that followed, Verina Davis would slowly reshape her identity, not just as the former First Lady of a defeated nation, but as a woman determined to define her own legacy. As the years passed after the American Civil War, the lives of Jefferson Davis and Verina Davis slowly moved in different directions. Jefferson Davis remained deeply tied to the past. Much of his time was spent defending the legacy of the Confederate States of America. Through speeches, letters, and eventually his large memoir, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, he attempted to explain and justify the actions taken during the war. For him, the conflict was not something easily left behind, but Verina began to evolve in a different way. Throughout her life, she had been an avid reader and a thoughtful observer of politics and society. Her earlier education, especially the time she spent studying in Philadelphia as a young woman, had exposed her to a wider range of ideas than many women in the Southern aristocracy. Now, in the quieter years after the war, those influences began to shape her outlook more openly. Friends noticed that Verina sometimes expressed views that were more moderate than those held by many former Confederates. She seemed less interested in defending old political arguments and more interested in understanding how the country might move forward. This difference occasionally created quiet tension between her and her husband. Jefferson Davis remained a symbol for many Southerners who believed their cause had been honorable despite defeat. Verina, on the other hand, appeared more willing to acknowledge the complex realities of the war and its consequences. In private letters, she sometimes wrote about the suffering the conflict had caused across the entire nation, not just in the South. These reflections revealed a woman who was thinking beyond the narrow political battles that had once defined her life. Gradually, Verina also began exploring ways to support her family through writing. Newspapers and magazines occasionally published her essays or personal reflections, and readers were curious about the perspective of the former Confederate First Lady. Her writing style was thoughtful and observant, often focusing on human experiences rather than political ideology. It was a small but important shift. For the first time in many years, Verina Davis was no longer simply a political figure defined by her husband's role. She was becoming a voice of her own. And in the decades ahead, that voice would eventually carry her far from the world of Confederate politics into the heart of a very different American society. In the decades following the American Civil War, Jefferson Davis remained a powerful symbol for many former Confederates. Even though the South had lost the war, large numbers of people continued to view him as a leader who had defended their region's honor. Across the South, Organizations and memorial groups began promoting what later became known as the Lost Cause narrative, a belief that the Confederate struggle had been noble and heroic despite defeat. Jefferson Davis was often placed at the center of that story. As he grew older, he spent much of his time speaking at public events and meeting with supporters who still treated him with great respect. For these admirers, he was not a defeated president, but a symbol of Southern pride. Yet time was slowly catching up with him. By the late 1880s, his health had begun to decline. Years of stress, imprisonment, and political controversy had taken a toll on his body. In 1889, while visiting New Orleans, Jefferson Davis fell seriously ill. Shortly afterward, he died at the age of 81. His death triggered a massive public reaction across much of the South. Tens of thousands of people attended memorial events and funeral processions honoring the former Confederate president. For many Southerners, it felt like the passing of the last great figure of the Confederate era. For Verina Davis, the moment was deeply emotional. She had spent more than 40 years married to Jefferson Davis, sharing both his rise to power and the devastating collapse of the government he once led. Now she faced life as a widow, carrying the legacy of one of the most controversial figures in American history. But Verina's response to this moment surprised many people. Instead of dedicating the rest of her life solely to defending the Confederate past, she began gradually moving away from the political culture that had surrounded her husband for so long. In the years after his death, Verina chose a path that few expected. She eventually left the traditional circles of former Confederate elites and relocated to New York City, one of the largest and most influential cities in the former Union. It was a remarkable decision. The widow of the Confederate president choosing to live in the North would have seemed unthinkable just a few decades earlier. Yet for Verina Davis, it marked the beginning of the final and most unexpected chapter of her life. When Verina Davis decided to relocate to New York City in the 1890s, the decision surprised people across both the North and South. For decades, she had been known primarily as the wife of Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War. Now, the widow of the Confederacy's president was choosing to live in the very region that had once been her husband's greatest enemy. But Verina's reasons were both practical and personal. After Jefferson Davis's death in 1889, financial stability remained a constant concern. Life in the South offered limited opportunities, especially for a woman trying to support herself and maintain some independence. New York, on the other hand, was rapidly becoming the center of American publishing, journalism, and cultural life. And Verina had something valuable to offer. Her experiences during the Civil War and her close connection to one of the most important political figures of the era made her story fascinating to readers. Publishers and editors knew that people across the country were still deeply interested in the personalities who had shaped the war. Soon after arriving in the city, Verina began working more seriously as a writer. She contributed articles and essays to magazines and newspapers, sharing reflections about history, politics, and the complicated memories of the Civil War years. Her writing style was thoughtful and often surprisingly balanced, avoiding the bitter tone that many former Confederate supporters still used when discussing the war. This approach helped her find acceptance in a city that might otherwise have rejected her. In New York society, Verina gradually built friendships with journalists, editors, and intellectuals who were curious about her life. Some of these people had once strongly opposed the Confederacy, yet they were intrigued by the woman who had lived at the center of its government. Among her acquaintances was Julia Dent Grant, the widow of Ulysses S. Grant, the very man whose army had defeated the Confederacy. The fact that these two women could eventually share social circles in New York revealed just how much the country had changed since the war. For Verina Davis, the move north was more than a change of location. It was a quiet step toward reconciliation in a nation that had once been violently divided. And in this new environment, far from the Confederate capital of Richmond, Verina would spend the final years of her life redefining how history would remember her. By the late 1890s, Verina Davis had settled into a new and unexpected life in New York City. The city was bustling, modern, and vastly different from the political world she had once known in Richmond during the American Civil War. Here, people were often more interested in literature, journalism, and intellectual discussion than the lingering rivalries of the Civil War. Verina's reputation slowly began to change. Instead of being seen only as the widow of Jefferson Davis, she was increasingly recognized as a thoughtful writer and observer of history. Her essays and reflections attracted readers who were curious about the human side of the war, the emotions, struggles, and personal stories behind the political headlines. But one development in her New York life surprised many Americans. She formed a friendly relationship with Julia Dent Grant, the widow of Ulysses S. Grant. During the Civil War, Grant had been the most powerful military opponent of the Confederacy. His victories had played a major role in defeating the government led by Jefferson Davis. In many ways, he represented the complete opposite side of the conflict that had defined Verina's life. Yet years after the war, the two widows discovered something unexpected. They had much in common. Both women had spent decades standing beside powerful and controversial husbands. Both had endured years of national conflict, public scrutiny, and personal hardship. And both were now widows trying to navigate life after their husbands' legacies had become part of American history. Their friendship symbolized something larger than either of them individually. It reflected the slow process of reconciliation that was taking place across the United States. Former enemies were beginning to see each other less as symbols of conflict and more as individuals who had lived through the same painful chapter of national history. For many observers, the image of these two women, once connected to opposite sides of the Civil War, sharing conversations in New York society, was remarkable. It suggested that the country might finally be moving beyond the divisions that had once torn it apart. And for Verina Davis, it showed how dramatically her own life had changed. The woman who had once been the First Lady of the Confederate States of America was now quietly helping build bridges between the former enemies of that war. But even as reconciliation slowly spread, one question still lingered in the background of her story. How would history ultimately judge the life of Verina Davis and the rumors that had once surrounded her name? Even as Verina Davis built a quieter and more reflective life in New York City, one strange element of her past never completely disappeared: the rumors. Decades earlier, during the American Civil War, critics and political enemies had spread whispers claiming that the wife of Jefferson Davis might have African ancestry. At the time, those accusations had been used as propaganda against the Confederate States of America. The goal had never been to discover the truth. The goal had been to embarrass the Confederate leadership. In the racially divided society of 19th century America, even hinting that the Confederate First Lady might be mixed race was meant to undermine the very ideology the Confederacy claimed to defend. Historians later examined these claims carefully. Most concluded that the accusations were largely political smears spread through newspapers and gossip during wartime. There was little credible evidence supporting the idea that Verina Davis secretly had African ancestry. Instead, the rumors likely grew from a combination of factors: her somewhat darker complexion, the intense political hatred between North and South, and the willingness of newspapers to print sensational stories during wartime. In other words, the story had been shaped more by propaganda than by fact. But even after the war, the rumor occasionally resurfaced in historical discussions, biographies, and political commentary. Once a scandal enters public memory, it can survive long after the events that created it have faded away. Verina herself rarely addressed the accusations directly. By the time she was living in New York, the political world that had once weaponized those rumors had mostly disappeared. The country had changed dramatically since the 1860s, and many Americans were far more interested in reconciliation and modernization than in old wartime gossip. Instead of fighting the rumors publicly, Verina focused on shaping her legacy through writing and reflection. She contributed to historical discussions about the Civil War, offering her perspective on the personalities and events that had shaped the era. Her memoir, Jefferson Davis, a memoir by his wife, helped preserve the personal story of her husband and the world they had once inhabited. Through her writing, she attempted to present a more human picture of the Confederate president, not just as a political figure, but as a husband and father. And in doing so, Verina Davis gradually reclaimed something that politics and rumor had once tried to take away from her: her own voice in history. Yet the final chapter of her story, and the way the nation would ultimately remember her, was still waiting to be written. By the early 1900s, Verina Davis had lived through one of the most turbulent periods in American history. She had witnessed the rise and fall of the Confederate States of America, endured the chaos of the American Civil War, survived public scandal and political attacks, and eventually rebuilt her life far from the world where her husband once held power. Now, in New York City, her days had become far quieter. She spent much of her time reading, writing letters, and maintaining friendships with writers, editors, and intellectuals who were interested in the Civil War era. Though she was no longer a central public figure, many people still saw her as a living connection to one of the most dramatic chapters in the nation's past. Visitors often came to speak with her about history. Some were journalists gathering stories about the war. Others were historians trying to understand the personalities behind the political events that had shaped the country. Verina had become something rare, a witness who had stood at the very center of the Confederate government during its rise and collapse. Yet those who met her during these later years frequently described a woman who seemed thoughtful and reflective rather than bitter. She had spent decades watching the United States slowly move toward reconciliation after the devastation of the Civil War. Former enemies now shared the same cities, businesses, and political institutions. The country had expanded westward, industries had grown rapidly, and a new generation of Americans was emerging that knew the war only through stories. In many ways, the world Verina now lived in was completely different from the one she had known as a young woman in the 1840s. Even the reputation of her husband, Jefferson Davis, continued to evolve. Some Americans still viewed him as a controversial figure responsible for rebellion. Others, particularly in parts of the South, continued honoring him as a symbol of regional pride. Verina rarely tried to control how history judged him. Instead, she seemed more interested in preserving the personal memories of the life they had shared. Through her memoirs and conversations, she presented Jefferson Davis not only as a political leader, but as a complicated human being who had lived through extraordinary events. As the years passed, her own story also became part of the nation's history. The woman who had once been the first lady of a breakaway nation was now living quietly in the largest city of the reunited United States, a powerful symbol of how dramatically the country had changed. But the final moment that would define her legacy was still approaching. In October 1906, Verina Davis passed away at the age of 80 inches, New York City. With her death, one of the last living figures directly connected to the highest leadership of the Confederate States of America was gone. For historians and journalists, it felt like the closing of a human chapter in the story of the American Civil War. But even in death, Verina Davis's story remained unusual. Instead of being buried in the North, where she had spent her final years, arrangements were made to return her body to the South. She was laid to rest beside her husband, Jefferson Davis, in Hollywood Cemetery. The location carried powerful symbolism. Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond had become one of the most important burial sites connected to Confederate history. Many soldiers and political figures from the Confederacy were buried there, making it a place where supporters gathered to remember the lost Southern nation. By placing Verina beside Jefferson Davis, her supporters ensured that the couple would remain permanently connected in the historical memory of the Confederacy. Yet her life had extended far beyond that identity. Unlike many former Confederate figures who spent the rest of their lives defending the past, Verina had eventually chosen a more complex path. She had lived among former enemies, built friendships in Northern society, and participated in the gradual reconciliation of a country that had once been divided by war. In many ways, her life mirrored the larger transformation of the United States itself. The nation that emerged after the Civil War was not the same country that had existed before it. Political systems changed, social structures evolved, and new generations grew up in a reunified nation. Verina Davis had lived long enough to witness that transformation. From the halls of power in wartime Richmond to the literary circles of New York City, her journey reflected a life shaped by conflict, loss, adaptation, and reflection. But even after her passing, one final question would continue to linger in the historical conversation surrounding her name. Not about war, not about politics, but about the strange rumor that had once followed her through the most dramatic years of her life. More than a century after the American Civil War, historians still study the lives of the people who stood at the center of that conflict. Among them, Verina Davis remains one of the most intriguing figures. Her life was filled with contradictions. She was the wife of Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Confederate States of America, yet she had spent part of her youth studying in the North. She lived in the Confederate capital of Richmond during the war, but later chose to spend her final years in New York City, surrounded by people who had once supported the Union. And throughout her life, she carried the weight of a rumor that had once been used as a political weapon. The accusation that Verina Davis might have been of mixed racial ancestry became one of the more bizarre propaganda stories of the Civil War era. During wartime, newspapers in both the North and South frequently published exaggerated or sensational claims designed to embarrass their enemies. In this case, critics of the Confederacy used the rumor to highlight what they saw as hypocrisy within a government that defended slavery and rigid racial hierarchies. But when modern historians investigated the story more closely, they found no reliable evidence supporting the claim. Most scholars now view the rumor as a mixture of wartime propaganda, personal attacks, and the intense racial politics of the 19th century. The accusation likely survived because scandalous stories tend to attract attention even when the facts behind them are weak. What remains far more historically significant is the life Verina Davis actually lived. She witnessed the rise and collapse of a government, endured the capture and imprisonment of her husband, rebuilt her life after national defeat, and eventually helped bridge the divide between former enemies in the United States. Few individuals experience the Civil War era from such a close and personal perspective. Today, historians see Verina not simply as the widow of a Confederate president, but as a complex figure navigating one of the most divided periods in American history. Her writings, especially Jefferson Davis, a memoir by his wife, remain valuable sources for understanding the personalities and emotions behind the events of the war. In the end, the rumors that once followed her say more about the political battles of the 1860s than about the woman herself, and perhaps that is the real lesson of her story. History is not only shaped by wars, governments, and leaders. Sometimes it is also shaped by the whispers, scandals, and human drama that surround them.